Okay. So without wasting much time, I want to just go into the topic for this evening's discussion. I will raise a number of issues, both from literature, from my experience as an academic, a female African academic, and also as Gule has said, the former research coordinator for our gender center, and what I learned from that I'll share with you so that we see how we can together confront epistemic injustice in academia. So what is the premise of our discussion or this topic? It is premised on the fact that knowledge production is political. Knowledge production is political in the sense that it is shaped by hierarchical or unequal power relations, by history and positionalities. And these then create or cause injustices to certain knowers. And because of the injustices that are caused to certain knowers, we say that the knowledge system that we have, the mainstream epistemology, the mainstream body of knowledge is undermined. The credibility of that knowledge cannot be a true reflection of human experience as a whole, because it doesn't reflect the experiences of all humanity. If that is the case, then what is our intellectual imperative as academics? As academics, we need to confront this, and before we can confront this, we need to frame the different experiences of injustices that we know. We need to unpack the interlocking systems of epistemic oppression. What are the structures that produce and reproduce these injustices? We need to highlight the agentic responses of the marginalized within the epistemic community and outline institutional responses. It is within the context of the institutional responses that we are going to highlight the role of gender centers and what they can do to also address the problem. As you may already know, the concept of epistemic injustice was coined by Miranda Freie in 2007 to describe two specific kinds of wrongs that are done a person or people as knowers. She talked about testimonial injustice, where a person's knowledge is dismissed, disregarded, or discredited simply as that. And then she talks about humanistic injustice, when a person lacks appropriate interpretive resources or language or framework to make sense of their own experience, let alone to communicate that. Because of gaps in the collective understanding, then we say that there's humanistic injustice against that person. We can use sexual harassment or postpartum depression as an example. Before we could name it, women suffered this for years and couldn't talk about it because they didn't have the appropriate language or framework to speak about it or to even interpret that experience. Very useful work done by Freie. That notwithstanding, it has also she has faced a lot of criticisms, and these are some of the critiques about her work. It's been criticized for being limited to individual justice. She limits herself to individual justices or prejudice. She's silent on colonial and historical legacies. She overlooks intersectionalities and the structures that produce the problem. She ignores institutionalized practices of silencing and then treats all marginalized knowers as passive victims with no agency. So these are some of the critiques about her work. That notwithstanding, her work is very useful. She named the experience that we all have faced over the years. Because of these critiques, others have tried to broaden the understanding of epistemic injustice. And I'll highlight just two. Very useful work by Audre Spivak, who introduced the term epistemic violence to also describe another type of wrong, which is the wrong done marginalized groups when dominant knowledge systems silence or misrepresent them, or when they deny them the agency to interpret their own experience, but try to interpret them using the dominant framework from an outsider's perspective. In that case, they destroy their agency and their voices in their own story. And that is epistemic violence, according to Spivak. Nora Bernstein also adds another dimension, which is epistemic exploitation. And this is very interesting. She says that it happens when individuals within a marginalized group are made to educate the dominant members of the dominant knowledge system about their oppression or their negative experiences at personal emotional cost, and sometimes without compensation or very little compensation. So if a female professor is constantly asked, there's a committee, we need a female to add on to it, to bring about the gender, the feminist experiences. It is a form of exploitation. It is treated as if the female is being done a favor, but actually she's being asked to educate the dominant group about her bad experience with no compensation often, right? So that is a form of exploitation, and we want to recognize it as such. So there are other additions of the different kinds of wrongs, but these are just to highlight the fact that there has been a broadened understanding of the term epistemic justice. And so in our current usage of the term, when we say epistemic injustice, we are talking about persistent systemic wrongs done to a people, specifically in their capacity as knowers. So there's a bit of moving away from the individual focus. That is not to say that individual experiences do not matter. Mostly the individual experiences are also embedded in their positioning within marginalized groups. And so we are highlighting the systemic nature of the problem. We are expanding the kinds of wrongs that can be done a person, and that will constitute epistemic injustice. Violence, exploitation, testimonial hermeneutic, and so many others if you read about it. So if we are saying it is systemic, then we should be interested in the structures that produce and reproduce this problem. How is the system created, and how does it work? And we are going back to the very notorious colonialism, patriarchy, and capitalism. So how did colonialism contribute to epistemic injustice? And which people did colonialism marginalize? Colonialism did not only take away resources from Africa. Unfortunately, I'm going to use Africa as an the example because that's where I'm most familiar with. They also created a universal reality, glorified European language as the only, dismissing all forms of knowledge forms as primitive, irrational, superstitious, and the like. And so there was mass destruction of African knowledge, philosophy, worldviews, and in a kind of epistemic genocide, what one author, Diso Sasanto, calls epistemicide, the mass destruction of indigenous knowledge as primitive and not worth anything. And then, once this was done, they used their knowledge as a form of control over their colonized communities. How did they do that? How did the epistemicide occur? They expunge our African languages and replace it with European languages. We are in Africa, we are studying French, we are studying English. That is the medium of epistemic engagement for us. Imposition of Western form of education, displacement of traditional authorities. Mind you, our philosophy worldview was not documented. It was carried by sages. And the traditional authorities were the sages. And once they displaced them, we lost that. And there was a bit of archival theft and knowledge appropriation as well. So through these processes, colonialism destroyed and marginalized Africans within the epistemic community and created what we know as Eurocentric epistemology. Okay. Now, patriarchy, also very much embedded in this colonial system, worked hard to silence and marginalize women as a group. Not just African women, but women everywhere were also parts of those who were marginalized as producers and as knowers. And we have lots of examples of women who have been erased from histories. Their work hasn't been acknowledged. We have examples of women who in the past could only get published if they use male names. If you use your female name, you won't get your work published, and so on. And these histories are still part of what we are calling the structures that produce the epistemic injustice and marginalize, this time not Africans, but women as a group. I want to mention objectivity as masked in the sense that we pretend to be sometimes studying, conducting objective research, contacting household heads, when all household heads, 70 or 80% tend to be males. In that case, without knowing or unknowingly, we exclude women's voices in our studies. We also frame our work as we are contacting workers, wage workers. Once you frame workers as wage earners, then you are excluding all those who are in the private spaces, who are working and are not earning income. And those are mainly, predominantly females. So these are some of the ways that we also use objectivity to mask male bias in mainstream knowledge acquisition. And with this, patriarchy also produced androcentric epistemology. Epistemology that is by men, about men, and if you like, for men. Then the third structure that has contributed to the problem is capitalism. Capitalism, and it is the current driving force of what we call the globalized knowledge system that we have it today. And this knowledge system is market-driven. It belongs to the rich. If you don't have money, you can't conduct research. Research is very expensive, whether in the social sciences or in the laboratories. And those who fund research determine the theory, the subject, the method. They have to validate that to give you money to conduct the research. And already they are the androcentric gatekeepers, so they are men. So female voices will not be funded to a large extent, and so on. And apart from the fact that it is very expensive to get published in journals, even conference attendance. Some of us in Africa, some colleagues, they find it very difficult to even attend conferences because buying air tickets and paying for conference fees is even a form of luxury, right? Even in the 21st century academic spaces in Africa. And this globalized knowledge system is also still very neo-colonial. We form partnerships all the time, North-South partnership. The PI is always from the North, and the South partners are collecting data, and the data is transported either via technology or via airplane back to. And we do all these things without even knowing that we are contributing to the neo-colonial, patriarchal, market-driven knowledge system that has been built over the years. And so this also, through this capitalism, knowledge has been commodified. All of us academics here, I don't know if you also wonder why we have to review manuscripts for free. And then once it is done, the journals sell the papers. Who is making that money? And then universities are struggling how to make money to conduct research. I keep asking, who is making that money? Where is the money from the sale of books and journals going? We are not compensated for reviewing. And universities have to pay. Meanwhile, the universities are paying our salaries. So these are some of the things we want to interrogate. There's something wrong with the globalized knowledge system, and we have to, as academics, confront it. systems interlock to create inescapable effects. Religion has been used by colonialism to reinforce its ideals. Colonialism used religion, it used patriarchy to reinforce its ideals. Patriarchy depends on religion to reinforce its ideals. And universities are built on colonial, patriarchal, and religious logics. And they are very conservative spaces and very slow to change, unfortunately. Okay. So because of our broadened understanding of epistemic injustice and our understanding of how it is produced, the systemic nature, in studying it, the students among us, if anybody wants to study this, what are the theoretical foundations? Many people have looked at this through the lens of social justice, colonial discourses, critical race. But I'm making a strong point that if you study epistemic injustice without including African feminist thought, post-colonial feminist theory, intersectionality, you are also missing a very important angle, because our understanding shows that the colonial legacy is very strong. Patriarchal structures are very strong in creating the problem. So to understand it, these are also very useful, and it must be included in theorizing around these issues. I want to just touch on 2 of our 4 or so examples of subtle forms it takes in our academic spaces to see if you can also relate. Epistemic microaggressions, the everyday verbal behavioral slights that question one's intellectual capacity or legitimacy. As professors, as a female professor, even a German female professor, have you experienced this? You are sitting at a meeting and the chair is speaking over you. You keep raising your hand. You are not called. And then finally you are called. From where I come from, they systematically refuse to refer us to me as Professor Akorsu. Yes, Professor that. Yes, Angela. And I keep asking, why am I not Professor Akorsu? And it is a very subtle way of telling them that her view is different, if not inferior. And this is done, or it is very subtle. When you complain, it's like you are too fussy, but it works. Sometimes you make a very good point at a meeting, as if the chair didn't hear. Another man says the same thing and is applauded, and you are like, okay, did they hear me? This is the same thing said in different words. So as faculty, how do we also do this? There's a black young woman in your class, write a very excellent essay, and you call the person and ask, this is a very good essay. Are you sure you didn't use AI? Are you sure you said you schooled in Nigeria? You didn't school in Germany. With surprise, you are questioning the student's ability to produce such excellent work. I mean, this is how we also kill initiative and potential. They are subtle. We can cite 101 examples, but we all, I know, have experienced these things in different ways, sometimes without knowing. Then we have citation injustices. That is very obvious. Because of the gatekeeping, where our publications also get to end, the places they are not the high impact journal. So there are some journals, if your data is from Africa, if it's qualitative, it's about women, they don't want to see it. And so there's all that happening. There's curriculum marginalization. And this one in Africa, we are also even victims. When I took over the teaching of philosophical foundation of development studies at my school, we were studying European philosophers. We had to include feminist epistemology and African philosophy in the content. even in our context. So I can imagine, I can't fault you if still your curriculum is very much silent on this basis. But we are all reminding ourselves and saying that it's about time we also open up in some of these regard. Then there is also this disproportionate surveillance and scrutiny. That's when people are applying for positions. Depending on their skin color, where they are coming from, their gender, then we scrutinize even more than we would. And then if the speaker of today's keynote is Black African coming from Africa, and then I have to work twice as hard to impress you as a white professor. If these things are occurring, we are saying that they are subtle, but they are feeding into the epistemic injustice that are so prevalent in our academic institutions. And then the institutional silencing culture that we have. When you complain, it is often dismissed also, that you are too something. I mean, this is nothing. And when it's very serious and you complain, bureaucratic epistemic exclusion, I mean, your complaints are hardly taken for granted. Remember, I will keep repeating, universities are built on colonial, patriarchal, and religious logic. Okay. Does that mean that our situation is hopeless? We are just, as women and as Africans, as minority groups from colonized communities around the world, we are just passive victims of epistemic injustice? No. In fact, one of the major critiques of Freie's work was the fact that she did not acknowledge the agentic role of the victims, right? And so today we can proudly talk about the agentic responses of the marginalized people. And so we see epistemological shift today anywhere. It's not only African philosophy that has developed. We have philosophy in other parts of the world. I'm sure Chinese philosophy, Indian worldviews are all well documented now than we had years ago. So the marginalized are also driving knowledge production to a large extent and developing alternatives to the mainstream, and which is laudable. We can boast of a good body of African philosophy. And that's what I've been engaging with my students with. And feminist epistemology broadly, and African feminist as a reaction to the mainstream feminist also. But I want to touch on the responses from African women for epistemic legitimacy. African women as a group, and some of the things that they are doing in the continent. So we see there's a building of an African feminist scholarship. And we have lots and lots and lots of scholars, African scholars. We are trying to do a systematic review of some of their work contribution to feminist theorizing. And so they are producing context-grounded feminist theory within the continent. And you can talk of Obioma Nyameka, yeah. That's the right pronunciation, right? Okay. Amina Mama, Akorsu Adumakwa, Prof. Many. And this is remarkable. So we are in the right direction, no matter how slow it is. Then there's also the building of autonomous feminist spaces in Africa. We have what we call the Feminist African Journal. Creating this journal has given many Africans an outlet to publish. People who otherwise could not get spaces into the mainstream spaces where there's so much gatekeeping. I've reviewed for this journal before, and strong comments, and the editor said, no, here we don't reject any paper. Here we build people up. No matter how long it takes, we are training them. We are training the next generation of African feminists. So every paper that comes, it is your responsibility as a reviewer to make sure you help the person, teach the person to get it published eventually. And that's ideal. it's wonderful and it's doing so much good. And that is how come we are also having so many people coming up strongly in that space. We have a cross-border feminist alliance. You can Google and read about the African Feminist Charter. That also highlights feminist ideals. In Ghana as a country, we have the Network for Women's Rights. And though it's made up of academics and civil society workers, the academic presence is very strong. And these are spaces where, when they get projects, they can also identify young female in those spaces and then invite them. People who otherwise will not get that opportunity to be on big funded projects. And through these spaces, they get to know about this. And then it's Doris here, yes. Yeah. African women are also using literature, film, music, and art forms to contest the silencing and propose alternative epistemology. And this is where, if some of your students are interested, you can have them collate African music and listen to the lyrics. What are they talking about? What expressions of their philosophic thoughts are there in those art forms? These are because for us, Africa, language is not the only epistemic medium. It is our music, our dressing, our food culture, our everything. And so these are very important. So once we study these things, then we are also preserving the worldview of a people who have been marginalized over the years. And this is what African women are doing. Ama Ate Edu, she died only recently. Her plays, she writes a lot of plays, are also very informative sources of epistemic and knowledge forms that are useful in this regard. Okay, so at this point, I want to talk about gender centers as institutional agents. Universities across the world are recognizing the fact that it's about time we dealt with epistemic injustice. And some of them have it in their mission, vision, or policy document. But I bet you when universities say that we want to deal with epistemic injustice, they are talking about reformist strategies, not transformative strategies. Universities, per their logic, they are very patriarchal, neo-colonial, and capitalist, if you like. Okay. So gender centers are founded to challenge power, address exclusion, amplify marginalized voices. All right. And that's what we have done over the years. Confronting epistemic justice then will not be anything new. It will not be an add-on. It will be part of our mandate. Just that because the issues are so many, we are challenged with sexual harassment, we are challenged with discriminatory recruitment practices and so many others, family-friendly issues. We kind of also push epistemic injustice to the background. But it is part of our mandate. We are supposed to challenge all these forms of injustices within the system. So we, as gender centers, we are already sized for resistance. And so we are well positioned to deal with this issue. In my university, we found a space for it, very small space though, in our gender policy. Because it is a statement, the policy is a statement of intent, and it's a good starting point that as a university, we are admitting that we have overlooked this for too long, and it's about time we want to address this issue. Then regular epistemic audits. My university too, we call it gender audit, and it's broad, and we try to capture who are publishing in gender studies, where are they located, and so on, together with so many gender factors. And sometimes the epistemic issues get lost in the so many issues. So if you have funds, I know funds is a problem anywhere. you can also separate it and have just gender, what do we call it, epistemic audit. So you want to review research funding parties at FUB, right? And this is spearheaded by the Gender Center. You want to review curriculum. How much are there spaces for alternative views? Authorship tracking. How much is our female faculty publishing? Where are they publishing? Are they publishing in the high impact journals or elsewhere? Right. And are they being cited? And so on and so forth. In fact, a good way to start is to encourage our graduate students to start this. If you don't have resources, we use them a lot to drive this if they are interested. And they learn through this, and then you also get the data. And then with this, you build a good database that you can use for sensitization and advocacy. Without the epistemic audit, it will be very difficult. Gule mentioned I'm going to use the experiences from SEGRAD. But these are things that we've thought of doing, we've started, but they are also not in the best of shapes. So as I'm reminding the Gender Center, I'm also reminding myself about things that we also need to improve in our own spaces. If possible, we conduct it regularly, annually, and by all means, intersectionality should be highlighted. Please, let's include students, faculty, and staff, because it's not only a problem among faculty. Students also suffer epistemic injustices, and so on. If we can make the findings public, perfect. Anonymous lived experiences in small flyers to also bring home the point to be, and then attaching action points. These are just suggestions to guide specific actions by the Gender Center. Sensitization advocacy is what already we are very good at as gender centers. This is what we've done over the years. But we want to also use sensitization to move away from just creating awareness to raising consciousness, right? We want to provide enough knowledge and create consciousness to the extent that our listeners will get allies who want to join us to change the situation, not just informing people of what happened. And the lived experiences usually help in that regard. Mentorship and solidarity networks. Can you have space at the Gender Center, creating safe spaces for knowledge sharing for young female academics, for instance, or for minority groups, where they can share their knowledge without feeling that some man somewhere or some knowledge broker somewhere is discrediting or not taking them seriously. Yeah, those spaces are very, in fact, they build confidence and develop the potential. Epistemic injustice somehow destroys so much potential, that we can't even count the cost for. Yeah. And these spaces will also empower members to articulate their experiences, and those who want to seek redress in blatant cases will also be supported through these networks. It's very useful. Our next generation of gender advocates, we want to keep an eye on them and support them, no matter what it is. We want to also disrupt the traditional gatekeeping, and let's learn from the Feminist African Journal. Can the Margarita Center have a journal of its own? So early career faculty can start from there. Can we have the determination that we don't reject anybody from a minority group, and that we use it as a space for training and scholars to publish? That's something you can also consider. We want to embark on epistemic repairs. The very first week I arrived in FUB, Mrs. Lynchard was walking me down to my office, and we saw the Hans Meta building, and she told me about that building, how it was renamed from Hans Building to Hans Meta Building, and how that's a good example of epistemic repair. Liz Meta apparently contributed to significant research, but her contribution was erased from the history. Her male partner was acknowledged. So if years later we discover this, we want to repair it. It doesn't hurt if we rename the building. It doesn't hurt if we rename the author of the book and add. We want to undertake some of these epistemic repairs to make a strong case that the fact that it is long past doesn't mean that it should remain like that. And this is also a laudable thing. So that is it for the gender centers. Individual faculty, students, what is our role? How does your own positionality shape your role in either reproducing or disrupting the colonial knowledge system? This is just a rhetorical question to have you think through. How do you also engage with your students from minority groups as faculty member? Your reading list, do you include African readers? And so on and so forth. So these are some of the things that we want to also do as individuals. And once we are very much aware of ourselves, then we can support faculty. I'm glad that we have affiliates of the center now that are going to be used. We have always had affiliates within the various spaces, and we use them a lot. And unfortunately, their work is voluntary. They are not compensated. I don't know if you have money to compensate them, but there's so much goodwill. There's so much goodwill. Even if you don't have resources, I can assure you that from our experience, many people within the university, even some men, are happy to be affiliates of the Gender Center, and they do support us a lot. And so we want to also hang on to these affiliates, and you call them membership, right? Members, and then and work along with them. So my concluding remarks. So far in the last 30 or so minutes, we've said that epistemic injustice is essentially an issue of knowledge coloniality. Colonialism is at the foundations of the problem on which patriarchy and capitalism was built. And so decolonializing knowledge systems is the best solution. And decoloniality calls for transformation, not reformation. We don't want to accept inclusion into an unjust system. That is reforming the system. And granted, transformation is a political agenda. It will breed resistance. It will breed conflict. Remember, our universities are patriarchal spaces. They are neo-colonial, and they will resist. We are very slow in changing as universities. Women in gender centers over the years have suffered persecution for fighting for inclusion and so on. And when we take on epistemic injustice too, we are going to meet resistance. I can assure you, you will meet resistance. But this is not to say that we should give up. We are not going to relent, are we? No. Why shouldn't we relent? Because we want to rehumanize the academy. We want to restore confidence in the credibility of mainstream knowledge as a site for freedom, justice, and dignity for all. Until this is done, knowledge systems as we have has credibility issues. They can't be a true reflection of the human race, only approximation or a reflection of some people. So now is the moment to move from critique to action. I'm looking at Prof. Chagla and Heike. And the moment to move from silent survivors to agents of change. And you have my support. Everybody here is here to support you. So please take on the battle and we will support you and we'll move. Thank you.